Hey, Damo, welcome to the Living podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure thing. I'm Canadian, originally from Vancouver. I lived in Tokyo for about 23 years now. Originally came over as a student doing an undergrad exchange program down at Osaka University. It was one of those things where when I was going to university, people that had been on exchange, when they came back, were doing an information session. When I happened to pop into it, they said, "Oh, it'll change your life." And I was kind of like, yeah, yeah, whatever, but sounds like, a good time. So applied for it, wound up getting it, got Japan, which was my first choice, and then spent a year in Osaka doing an exchange program down there. While I was in Osaka, I was bonding with my fellow foreign exchange students and actually tore my Achilles tendon playing basketball with the guys. So then wound up having surgery and getting to experience a whole bunch of stuff in Japan that people don't usually experience when they're on exchange. However, that turned out to be a real blessing in disguise because without being able to go anywhere or do anything, naturally, that meant that I was studying the entire time. So it really helped me to sort of crack, the kanji code
Yep.
and build vocabulary and be able to converse better in Japanese. That then led to a scholarship. So went back to Canada and then came back to Japan for grad studies. Studied at a place called Hitotsubashi University here in Tokyo for a couple of years, and then got into the banking industry following that. So I started in banking in 2004, originally with Citigroup, and then with a couple other firms since then. Um, I started out in fixed income sales because I really like talking to people, and um, I thought that that would be a good use for that. But then once they got the spreadsheets in front of me, I sort of fell in love with the spreadsheets and became discovered that some of the things that I was able to do in spreadsheets and whatnot were probably more suited to the role of trading. So I've been a fixed income trader for the past, I guess, 15 plus years now.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so that's that.
Sure.
That's the professional side.
Yeah. And actually, when you said, yeah, you tore your Achilles, which is a horrible thing to happen, I thought that was going to be the start because when we're going to talk about your bodybuilding, it's like I tore my Achilles inside. It was just stuck to the bench press for the next 9 months. But yeah, your bodybuilding side. I mean, what did you do athletically growing up? Did you play sports? Did you play hockey like most Canadians?
Yeah, well, naturally, that's in the DNA, right? So,
Yeah.
in my younger years, it was primarily hockey and skiing. And then when I got into high school, I started to do taekwondo because that was around about the time that all the martial arts movies were really famous,
Mm.
Chuck Norris and all that jazz. And then following that, when I got into university, that started to fall to the side. But that's when weight training started to come into the picture. I just liked it because, I mean, it was fun. And then when I was going to university, sort of in the late 90s, um, that was when Dorian Yates had become Mr. Olympia and all that kind of stuff. So myself and a couple other friends got into training quite steadily then. Um, sort of, of course, everyone starts with the training, right? So trying to mimic the workouts that we had seen in the bodybuilding magazines and stuff like that. And then eventually started to realize that I needed to eat a lot more because I'm kind of a skinnier guy usually. So that involves sort of learning that I actually had to force feed myself in order to grow, which was pretty uncomfortable. Um, and I successfully bulked up and then started to cut down. And that was right when I came to Osaka. Actually, it was when I was dieting down a little bit because I had become pretty roly poly. Came here, got the injury. That actually took me out of training for quite a long time. Also, starting my career, I found that I had to spend most of my time learning how to use the spreadsheets and whatnot that I was just talking about. Um, and I wound up getting back into the gym in about 2007. That was around about when Bear Stearns was starting to teeter and the GFC was just about to kick off. I was trading interest rate options at the time. So, there were plenty of times when I would wake up in the middle of the night, sort of check where market levels were and not be able to go back to sleep. So, um, gold was 24 hours. So,
Yeah.
I just kind of remembered what I used to do to calm myself when I was younger. and that was just go to the gym. So I decided I would use that as the opportunity to get back into the gym. And sure enough, that did help. The general pattern that's happened with training and whatnot is, of course, when you're starting out, everyone tends to emphasize the big three or the really basic moves, right? So I really focused on that for the first couple of years when I was getting back into it, focusing mainly on building strength, etc. But then I started to discover that I was actually very good at getting strong and not growing,
Yeah.
which is obviously not what I wanted to do. So although I was pound for pound quite strong, I wasn't getting the results that I wanted. So that's when I started to delve more into nutrition, and to try to figure out, what piece of the puzzle I was missing there. And then eventually I wound up changing my training style as well. Because, lifting 5 by 5 may be a great program to start with or something like that, but it's not really, something that you can expect to build the type of physique that I wanted to build. So
Yeah, sure. And so, we mentioned Dorian Yates there. I mean, and you said, I guess, copied exercise programs out of magazines and things. Were you sort of influenced? Dorian at certain points was famous for doing very high intensity, low volume sort of protocol. Did you go through phases of doing some of that?
oh, absolutely. And I mean, I still kind of, I use concepts that are kind of similar to that today, right? I mean, even though Dorian's style was always purported to be one set to total
Mm,
failure and beyond, right? I mean, there was a bit more to it than that.
yeah,
Obviously, there were workup sets or warm-up sets that led up to it. So, but certainly it was it was definitely that top set that did it. If you look at the way that the guys that are coming out of the top building bodybuilding camps, I'll call them, right? In terms of the guys that sort of have a similar style being coached by a similar type of person. So the one camp in particular that sort of comes to mind are the guys down in Florida. So that's like Matt Jansen and his crew, and then also those that are training with Joe Bennett, who goes by Hypertrophy Coach on Instagram. If you look at the way that those guys suggest training, particularly with the larger compound lifts, they usually recommend going to, working up in, for example, sets of 4 until you get up to your working weight. And then when you're at the working weight, you do a top set, probably somewhere between, we'll call it 6 and 10 reps, depending on, whether you're doing 6 to 8 or 8 to 10, just kind of depends on the body part. And then doing a back off set after that, where you'll reduce the weight a little bit, increase the reps as well, but still go to failure. And that seems to be getting everybody, pretty good results. So on the main compound lifts, right? Obviously on the isolation lifts, it's a little bit different. You're probably looking for more of a volume based approach on that.
yeah,
What's the general concept being that you want to go and cause damage to the muscle first, and then flood as much blood into it as possible after through the
yeah,
higher volume pump stuff. So, yeah, so it's kind of I think that bodybuilding has sort of moved in the direction of there seems to be less of like champs saying, the low volume only or versus, high volume pump work. It's still very prevalent. Like I think that people do have a preference. A lot of that probably depends on their particular body type. But
yep,
when they get I think that like generally speaking, if I were to recommend something that I think would probably work for most people, it would be by combining those two.
sure, sure. And at what stage did you? I mean, you talk about changing your training program up to emphasize hypertrophy or a goal physique. Did you have the idea of your competition in mind, or where did that sort of come into it, or did you go through
Oh yeah.
stages where you were treating your training just as I guess a bit of stress relief and a hobby to a bit more of a serious endeavor, and then sort of looking towards really taking it to the next level with competition? What was that sort of timeline?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's just been a progression the whole time,
Mm,
right? So, when I started out, it was for stress relief, as I mentioned. Like, I'm ignoring what my dreams were when I was younger, right? And just sort of like in terms of the in terms of the past 15 or so years of continuous training,
yeah,
what it was originally started as a stress relief, right? And then it was the one of the things that I really liked is I ran a program called 531. I'm sure you're
yep,
familiar with that, a Jim Wendler. And the thing that was awesome with that is every single workout you're hitting a PR of some sort, right?
yep,
Unless you're doing your debug. right? But
Yep.
whether it's a rep-based PR or weight-based PR, and that building of PRs on top of PRs every day is psychologically very good, right?
Yep.
It makes you feel awesome because you're constantly getting this progress, which then makes you want to train harder, et cetera, et cetera. Then, from there, so I sort of, I got it. Well, I wouldn't say addicted, but I mean, that's like, a very good, that was a very good feedback loop to have. And then from there, eventually I ran into the point where I mentioned my nutrition needed to get a little bit more serious. So, started looking at that. And then, obviously, as you're going along, the habits that you start to bring into your life literally can be changing one thing every couple weeks, right? And, when you're adding something new or changing something over the course of time, eventually you wind up as like a guy that sits here and eats 6 meals a day with
Mm.
everything weighed and timed and, pre-planned and go through various bulking stages, cutting stages, all that kind of stuff. In terms of the actual, like, saying, "Okay, I'm gonna try to compete," that happened in 2014, in September. And what that was is I went and I saw the Mr. Olympia, in person in Vegas,
Mm.
for the first time. Of course, as a kid, it was always one of those things that was kind of like bucket list, right? I wanted to go see that show. So we went there, and the image that I had always had of bodybuilders heading up to this point was that most of them were kind of, you know, narcissistic, like kind of full of themselves, not exactly the type of people that I want to hang out
Yeah. Sure.
But then when I went to the expo, I really got that wrong. Everyone was incredibly welcoming and supportive, and it was a really really great atmosphere. So I said to myself, "All right, I'm 30. I think it was 30. I just turned 39. So I said, if I put a year into this, right, and you know, put go through a big bulking phase and then prep for a show, I can do my first. I can do a show as a masters and see it going
Yeah.
because masters starts at 4.
Okay.
So then I did that, and then again that feedback loop started again. So I won my first show, and then I competed in a couple other shows that year and won or placed second type of thing. So the feedback from that was very encouraging as well. Then I tried the next year competing overseas, did pretty well there as well. And then the following year, same thing. Then I've had a couple of injuries recently. Placings haven't been where I've wanted them to be, but I mean, we'll see how it goes. I've got, I just did my rotator cuff, so I'm battling, kind of pushing through that right now. And then when that gets up, I'll see sort of how everything looks once the muscle's back on.
Yeah, I'm sure. Um, and I mean, going through this process, what has that increased focus? And because it is a very, very focused discipline, what's that done for sort of other parts of your life and your sort of career?
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely. So this is, I mean, I really can't thank bodybuilding enough for what it's brought to my life. In that, because the training and the nutrition is as disciplined and as regimented as it is, that's actually sort of that forms the backbone of my life, basically. In order to be able to eat 6 times a day, you're eating every 2.5 to 3 hours, which means that you need to have things quite well planned out. Right. So, because everything is very planned out, also with the recovery, you need your sleep. That lends everything to sort of begin to follow a pattern,
mm,
which I'm sure a lot of people think, well, that sounds boring, right? Or like too much work or something like that. But I actually find that I perform best in life when I have that sense of structure and sense of routine in my life. So,
sure.
yeah, so it's brought a lot to me. Obviously, the fact that I train first thing in the morning then makes me a calmer person throughout the day because obviously I let everything out in the morning.
Yep.
So, I hope that I'm a more pleasant person to be around for the rest of the day. And yeah, I mean, the friends, it's brought, obviously a much broader, range of friends into my life as well. Because, obviously if you're just in banking, you tend to constantly run into the same people, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas this has helped to, create, I'd say, a bit more balance, right? So I have a very different group of friends, like a lot of the competitors that compete alongside me are, service members in the military, right? Or other expats in different industries that have come out. So it's really great to be able to meet such a broad range of people.
Yeah, yeah, not very cool. Um, so yeah, what does the training schedule look like for you?
Sure.
What's your
So
week?
off season, so broadly speaking, my life is kind of split up into two different seasons, meaning off season and competition season. Um, Off season for me is anytime I'm not getting ready for a show. So that means that it's not like, for example, an athlete who would have, say, a baseball season and then would have a distinct off season where there's no actual baseball games going on, and they may do their training in the off season or may take it easy, that sort of thing. That's not really what happens in bodybuilding, right?
Mhm.
Because bodybuilding, it's the off season where you have to build your size, right?
Yeah.
And where you have to make those improvements to your body. And then the competition season is more about stripping down to be able to show what you've been able to build in the off season. So the off season is actually just as important as the prep season. Okay, so putting that to the side, the training is generally 4 or 5 days a week, and I would say probably about 90 minutes a session. And that 90-minute session will be probably an hour and 15 minutes of lifting, and then 12 to 15 minutes of high intensity intervals at the end of it,
Okay.
just to keep some cardio in. Now, when we get into competition prep, obviously the training time goes up pretty significantly. Um, I wouldn't train with weights 7 times a week, but I would train with weights 5 times a week for sure. And then cardio can get as high as twice a day, where typically what I do is I do intervals after my weightlifting and then do low intensity steady state in the evenings. So, you'll have 2 sessions there. And then even on the days that you don't go into the gym, um, on the 2 days that I wouldn't go into lift, I would still be doing cardio. And there's actually a pretty strong chance I'd go to the gym anyways, just to either like work on my posing or stretching, some sort of like mobility work.
Wow. Um, a lot of questions with that. Have you? So you generally find that when you go into a cutting phase, that you increase the amount of volume. I was actually. Sounds terrible. I was up in the middle of the night with my 7-year-old, 7-month-old, and I was actually reading a mass research review article on that. The
Yeah.
yeah, the bodybuilding prep when you're in the cutting phase, increasing volume to maintain lean mass, which is again, as we were talking off air, but yeah, differences between bodybuilding and strength and conditioning. Um, for a combat athlete, for example, you would generally use that phase to actually decrease training volume because you're trying to optimize neuromuscular efficiency and readiness to fight. Whereas, yeah, I find it interesting, yeah, with the bodybuilding tap that having to actually increase the training volume when you're in a calorie deficit to try and maintain more of that muscle mass. So I guess because as a bodybuilder, you have a lot more muscle mass, so the potential for it to decrease quite quickly if you don't have that training stimulus is a lot more than, say, with a fighter that might have a moderate amount of muscle mass. They're not necessarily going to lose that if they drop the training intensity during the cutting phase. Um,
I think there's a couple of reasons for that, right? Like in the case of an athlete or a fighter, that's a performance-based sport, right? So your performance on the day of is what matters, right? Whereas with bodybuilders, more often than not, we're pretty much at our most fragile state we could possibly be when we step on the stage.
yeah,
We're dehydrated. We have, uh, you know, generally been underfed for 16 weeks, usually. Um, Little body fat, hormones all over the place. Right. So it's a very different focus, right?
yeah,
In terms of increasing the volume, it's not so much increasing the volume of the weight training. So the way that I look at prep is when you're training with weights in prep, you are trying to remind your body, I need this muscle,
yeah.
right? So and that's actually why I don't change. I was still setting PRs on deadlifts and things like that 5 days out of the show in my last prep. And the mentality that I'm going in with is I need to maintain every piece of muscle that I have. So I will not tolerate my lifts going down. If anything, they're going up, right? Straight, like, you know, take a big pre-workout drink with a lot of caffeine in it and, crank up the death metal and here we go, right? Because
Yeah.
that's what the mentality is there. Then the other variables that you have are your nutrition, right? Particularly your carbohydrate intake, and then your cardio, right? So in terms of increasing the volume, we can increase the cardio without having much of an impact on our muscle mass, right? And that's kind of, the main variable that we would tweak in terms of activity. But
Yep.
in terms of caloric intake, obviously we have pretty dramatic changes in that between off season and preparation season.
Yeah. I know some physique athletes that do sort of avoid high intensity interval training, that they find the fatigue associated and potentially metabolic damage associated with that actually impairs their resistance training program. Have you sort of experimented with both taking the high intensity intervals out, and I'm sure you sort of played around with that a bit. What
Yeah, so
kind of works for you?
I've done everything from no cardio and prep and
Mhm.
retiring and relying completely on dietary changes, to doing like an hour of low intensity steady state along with say 20 minutes of high intensity intervals, right? So I mean I've kind of run the full spectrum there, right?
Yeah.
Uh, in terms of the intervals affecting my training, no, I don't find that. I do that after my weight training, obviously. Right?
Yeah.
So the training comes first, and then whether or not my intensity slips on my intervals, to me, I don't really care about that. What I'm more focused on is just the mentally knowing that I'm pushing as hard as I possibly can during those intervals.
Yeah.
So if there's a slight decline in my performance metrics, like I don't know, whatever, maybe the pedals aren't going as fast or something like that, then I'm generally not too concerned about that. It's just, to me, that's more of a mental thing. Like if you're going for it and you're getting as fatigued as you possibly can, you're in prep, right?
Yeah.
You're going to be fatigued by definition, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this is where you have to suck it up and say, okay, but I'm going to make sure I push myself as hard as I can, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But,
That's
throughout the rest of the day, I mean, it's pretty miserable in the past in sort of the final, I would say 4 to 6 weeks. It gets to the point where, like, so you've lost so much fat off of your butt, for example, that if you sit down on a hard surface, it actually hurts, right?
yeah.
You
Yeah.
when you're walking, every step is quite an effort, right?
Yeah.
But the thing is you have to go through that if you want to look good on stage.
Yeah.
It's just it's a given. There's no way around it. It's much the same as like, if you're trying to lose weight, by definition, you're gonna feel hungry
Yeah.
because that's your body telling you that it needs more. But the whole thing is you have to use your mind to overpower that to say, yes, I'm aware that this is what my body's saying, but I want to look like this. So if I want to do that, then I have to override these urges. Drink a
Yeah.
lot of water or something.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I've sort of say I'm sort of seeing my sister-in-law Mickey going through it now in contest prep. She's looking pretty miserable, partying it very well, of course. And I've seen Jared go through it as well when he was at 360. I've always thought I'd much rather you try and cut 4 or 5 kilos of fluid in a week for a fight rather than go through that. Yeah, I mean, but I can also see how that pushing through that discomfort can really bring a lot out of you. And even, like I said, with the high intensity interval training, sometimes and it's the same in fighting. And I'll probably continue to draw parallels between the two. But a lot of those physiological interventions that we're using end up being more psychological. Yeah, you're using them more as a psychological intervention to train that mental toughness. Um,
That's actually one of the main rewards that I get from bodybuilding is when
yeah,
I'm on stage, right? And I know that for 16 weeks, I have not had an extra grain of rice than I was scheduled to have.
yeah.
That I have not done a single minute less of cardio than what I had scheduled, right? And
Mm,
that I didn't lose any of my strength in my lifts, right? When
yeah.
I have that, when I'm standing on stage, I can't control who else shows up. right? So I
Of
can't
course.
control if I win or if there's somebody better there, or if there's, you know, judges are people too, right? So, if there's like judges that reward this kind of body over another kind of, over another type, then there's really nothing that I can do about it. All I
Yeah.
can do is take the factors that are within my control, which is the dietary and training adherence, right? And then know inside that I'm looking the best that I've looked, right? And I have done all of these things correctly, and just enjoy that, right?
Yeah.
And then when you have that, then it doesn't really matter where the placings come anyways, right? Now, I hate saying that because it makes it sound like I don't want to win, but that's not the case, obviously. But
Yeah.
I do recognize that there are some things that are a little bit beyond what I can control, right? And especially being here, competing in Japan as a guy in his mid 40s, right? A Caucasian guy in his mid 40s that's standing on stage with a bunch of 20 something Japanese guys,
Yeah.
right? It's a bit of a different look, right?
Yeah.
So, I completely understand if it's like hard to compare, or, you know, if they're better looking than me, that's fine. I can handle that, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I mean, it's again, drawing another parallel, but yeah, if you're playing, yeah, football or hockey, you hit the puck or into the net, you score the goal, pretty straightforward. With fighting, obviously not the person out, you're not the person out, but a lot of combat sports are judge based, and there's a lot of subjectivity in terms of the analysis. And every fighter has been pissed off at some point by losing a fight that they thought they won. I look at physique sports, and it's just a whole other realm of subjectivity. It's just you look better than you. Now, obviously, I'm completely ignorant in this space, and there's obviously very specific judging criteria. But at the same time, there must be a massive subjectivity element to that, and it must be difficult to, if you thought you may have, you been the superior, you had the superior physique, and then lost out.
oh,
That must be frustrating.
there were shows that I've been certain that I won, and that the people around me are certain that I should have won, where I didn't even place. So it's highly subjective, and it is frustrating. But again, as I said, I always try to focus more on what did I do myself in the prep, and how did I look relative to my last show, and that's what I have to go on, because
Yes, yes.
I know that I was winning shows years ago, and I'm better than I was then.
Yeah, yeah,
So I know I'm progressing, right? So it's just a matter of, whatever, different people showed up, the environment was different. I don't know, etc.
yeah,
The one thing that I would say is that in the larger markets for bodybuilding, so for example, in the US in particular, maybe the UK, because of the size of the population of bodybuilders, the judging criteria actually seems to be a lot more standardized than it is in places where there are fewer competitors. And
yeah, yeah,
the reason for that is, in the US, for example, there are so many people up there that the very first thing that they check is everyone's conditioning. Right? Is there anyone that like is not in shape? And if there's anyone that's not in shape, then they're automatically ejected.
yeah,
Like they're not, they're just like tossed to the side. So the very first thing they look at is the conditioning, and then after that, they're like, and also the judges know that in order to get into conditioning, that's actually what you have to work at, right? You can't pick what parents you were born with in terms of body structure, but if you suffered through your diet or not and showed that you wanted to be on the stage, then that's worthy of something. So they do reward that. So
right.
that's kind of cool. After that, of course, it's like, muscle mass, symmetry. Those are the types of things, stage presence. Those are the types of things that start to come in. That's quite easy when you've got, 50 competitors in the class. Right?
Yeah,
On the other hand, when you've got, say, 7 or 8 guys in a class, and you've got one guy who's really big, one guy who's really small but ripped, and then you've got one guy that's like kind of ripped but not as muscular, and you got another guy who's a little more muscular but not as ripped, right? It becomes much more difficult because you're no longer comparing apples with apples or
mm,
oranges with oranges. You've really got apples, oranges, pears, everything up there. So, then it becomes like personal preference becomes a lot more reflected in that. And of
yeah,
course, this is easy to discuss, I guess, for me as somebody that's competed for a few years, and to be honest, is in mid 40s and has that maturity level. Right.
yeah.
For the younger guys, I think it can be quite frustrating for sure.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, in terms of like sort of bodybuilding scene in Japan, I mean, you've alluded to it being a little bit smaller, and that may be affecting the judging criteria. You're obviously very familiar with different camps of bodybuilding in the US. I mean, are there some big differences between the two sort of scenes? I don't know, it's two, not two, but Japan compared to the rest of the world. How would you sort of describe the Japanese bodybuilding scene?
Yeah, so the Japanese bodybuilding scene is, it's actually, to me, it feels like it's just started. There traditionally has been a Japanese bodybuilding scene that sort of became popular back in the 70s and 80s. Um, and then there was one federation that pretty much controlled everything. And they, obviously, because they had no competition, were, very set in their ways and took the sport in a certain direction, which deviated from where the rest of the world led the sport. So, um, that resulted in Japanese bodybuilders basically not being able to be competitive overseas, and not being able to really hold their own, which is really strange because when you look at the impact of, for example, what Chinese and Korean bodybuilders have been able to do, particularly in the past few years, as the international arena has sort of opened up.
Mm,
Um, Everyone's looking great, and there's some pretty amazing bodybuilders in both of those countries.
yeah.
Now, fortunately, there was another competing organization that formed here in Japan, and they have been trying to push the sport more in the direction of what the rest of the world is doing. So that's very exciting, and that has been sort of recognized by us now having events like the Amateur Olympia Japan, right? And other sort of, we now have national pro qualifiers as well. So that organization has been doing a very good job to sort of quickly bring Japan back into relevance, right? They've only been around for the past 5 or 6 years, so it's actually created quite a splash.
Okay.
There's also, and the thing that I kind of like about Japanese bodybuilding is they also have these really different um, competitions that they have, like Best Body Japan and Summer Style, right? Now, these are not something that I would be interested in, right?
Mm,
It's kind of more like, shall we say, slimmer look,
sure.
and kind of little less um, based on actual. It's more of a beauty contest than a bodybuilding show. But
Yeah.
the thing that I like about it is that it gets more people interested in the sport. And there's
Yeah.
plenty of people who start out in these best body or in these summer style type shows and then progress into, the NABA, the FWJ, even the JB. So to me, anything that creates more interest in the sport and makes it more accessible is very welcome, right?
Mm,
Because inevitably that'll wind up with the quality of Japanese bodybuilding getting much better than it has been.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's very cool.
Yeah. So in terms of the scene, I mean, I did allude that it's a bit of a smaller scene. I mean, bodybuilding is kind of a niche sport no matter where you go.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, because it is kind of a unique lifestyle, and the sacrifices that are required to compete. I think that they're shared by the people in that community, but then a lot of people outside of the community don't necessarily see that. So they're like, "You guys are all nuts, right?"
Yeah,
Uh, but yeah, here in Japan, obviously, there's like a smaller sort of microcosm of like expat, or non-Japanese competitors as well, and that's obviously an even smaller, tighter community. But I mean, my experience with both the local competitors here, as well as the foreign for the originally foreign people that are competing here, is that generally speaking, I've met far more nice people, right, than I have had negative experiences with. So
yeah,
it's just been, as I was saying, like it's been a great way to meet a whole bunch of people from a bunch of different walks of life, and it's I really value that.
yeah. I mean, we've talked about the state that you put yourself in during contest prep, and obviously it's a massive challenge. Are there any other sort of major challenges that you've found through the sort of bodybuilding career? And Um,
Uh, well, injuries, right? Yeah, a couple of years ago, I blew my ACL skiing and then had to have surgery from that. So coming back from that, um, I, uh, I did my ACL in February, had surgery in March, and the very first amateur Olympia Japan was in November. So I had it in my mind that I wanted to do the November show. And most of the literature that's out there for ACL recovery, everyone always talks about return to sport. And I think that if you're an athlete, and you're, say, a basketball player or a soccer player or something like that, that a return to sport, obviously just means when you get the functionality back and enough strength to play your sport back,
yeah,
not necessarily being a peak performance. Um, in the case of bodybuilding, what I found out through my own experience is that it's actually longer than what they would prescribe as return to sport, right? Because they're saying, oh, return to sport is probably about 6 months, etc. Um, in the case of bodybuilding, you have to return to sport first, meaning that you have to be able to lift again. But in addition to that, you have to wait for your body to catch up.
yeah,
So, what happened when I tried to, I wouldn't say rush my prep, but when I tried to compete in such a short time frame, although I was able to gain the strength back, I didn't get my size back. So then when I stood on stage, I was like pretty badly imbalanced.
yeah, sure, sure.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier that I've done my rotator cuff now. I just had surgery on that 3 months ago. But now using that experience, I know that, okay, so I'm 3 months out, which means that now I have the all clear to train um, as much as, I want, or as far as I can push myself to my limits, and that's going to be fine. And I figured that it'll probably take 2 to 3 months to get my strength back. In addition to that, that's roughly about the same timeline that I had with the ACL. And then from that point, I know that it's going to take me another 6 months or so to regain the size and get the balance back, right? So,
Yeah.
with that in mind, I'm probably looking at competing sometime sometime next year, hopefully earlier half of next year. But yeah, I mean the injuries are challenging, and I think that I can see how they can knock people out because they're pretty um, especially in the whole, give it to me now type of society that we live in.
Yeah.
I think it'd be very easy to throw your hands in the air and say, I don't want to do this, especially, if you've got a year and a half recovery before you can do a show again. But I mean, bodybuilding is a sport really that's measured more in like decades than months, right? so,
Yeah.
so yeah, a bit of a different mentality. I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Craig, I'm going to go on to just a few little things. What would you advise people if they were interested? And then I'll actually finish up. And then I'm thinking just with the flow of the episode to finish up there, and then actually just spending a few more minutes nerding out on some more training related stuff. I'm just thinking
Sure, yeah.
the majority of the people that would be interested, it's probably a good length, but then I'll release it as like a bonus episode where we can just talk a little bit more about
Oh,
training.
sure.
Uh,
No,
Let me just so, Greg, if say someone has either lifted throughout their life, they've played sports when they were younger, and they've done resistance training as part of that, or they've sort of got into the gym in adulthood and they've built up a decent sort of background in training, and they've maybe sparked, or maybe even this conversation, seeing the amazing stuff that you've done, and sparked an interest in bodybuilding. And maybe they just think, oh, have I got the right physique? Have I got enough size to actually cut down and make a realistic attempt at bodybuilding competition? What would you recommend for people thinking about maybe getting into it?
sure. So a couple of things. The first thing that I would recommend is go see a bodybuilding show, because a lot of the times I think if you haven't been to a show in person, it's kind of hard to really understand what it's about. When you see When you see the pictures and whatnot, that's one thing. But when you actually go to a show and you can feel the atmosphere, it's actually a lot more exciting than when you just see something on TV or 20-second snippet there or a picture of somebody on Instagram, right?
Yeah, yeah, for
Um,
sure.
and if I were to recommend what kind of shows to go see in Japan, um, I I don't even know if I'm allowed to do this or if I'm going to get flack for this someday. But FWJ, that's Fitness World Japan. They're the ones that run the IFBB Pro League qualifiers here. They have some very big shows, like they have a Japan National Pro Qualifier in May. They also have Amateur Olympia, which is usually around November type area. Those two shows are amazing if you want to go to see them. Pretty expensive to be honest, but it's pretty, it's kind of well worth it. Or another thing that's a really good kind of cheaper way to do it is instead of going to the actual show itself, you'll see actually behind me, my background says Blaze Open.
Mm.
Blaze Open is the regional qualifier that's immediately before the national show in May. So a lot of the same competitors are competing at the Blaze Open because you have to do a regional show to qualify. So, that's kind of a way that you could go and, go see a smaller show, but still be able to feel the environment and not necessarily break the bank to see it.
Yeah.
The reason why I recommend that too is also because when you get there and you see all of the people competing, it may make you feel a little bit more comfortable in terms of, well, there's actually people of all different sizes, right? People of all different shapes, people of all different conditioning that are doing this, right? So I think that it helps you to understand a little bit more that you don't have to necessarily look like Mr. Olympia to start bodybuilding.
Yeah, sure.
And um, and that's a really big thing because in order to become a pro in bodybuilding for a male, it generally takes 5 to 10 years of compete. So 5 to 10 years of competing. So that means that if you start out and you don't necessarily win your pro card in your first year, you are not a failure, right? You're pretty much on par, right?
Yeah, sure,
There
sure.
are so many things that are involved in the sport, whether it's, the whole, okay, so I mean, obviously there's the training, there's the nutrition, but then there's posing, and then there's stage presence. And then there's just stuff like that. Like when you look at the guys who have never practiced posing or anything and they get on stage, they're shaking. They may have the best physique, but if they're shaking and they don't know how to pose correctly, then they're not going to look as big or as confident or carry the same air, so all that sort of stuff comes into play.
Mm. Yeah, yeah.
So I would really suggest getting up to go see a show and just kind of relax and understand that you don't have to, win everything straight from the get go in the very first show you ever did. And actually, there's a lot more involved to it than what you might think.
Yeah.
With that in mind, and the fact that there is so much involved as well, I would strongly recommend hiring a coach.
Yeah.
And that's simply because uh, um, what happens with a lot of people, even if they're quite well versed in nutrition, is especially when you get into the last 4 to 6 weeks, where I was saying every step is an effort. When you get into that sort of situation, you need an objective pair of eyes to tell you what's going on with your body. Everyone has this.
Mhm.
No matter how many times that I've done shows, I mean, I know that in that last 4 to 6 weeks, I'm going to sit there, I'm going to look at myself in the mirror and I'm going to say, oh my God, I still have so much more fat to lose. What am I going to do? And then the next minute, I'll look at myself and think, oh my God, I'm so small. I've lost all the muscle. What am I going to do? And then
Yeah.
the next second, I'm going to look at myself and say, hey, I'm actually looking pretty ripped. Like the way this new vein and this new striations coming through, et cetera, et cetera. It's just all over the map, right?
Yes.
So you don't have someone to sort of right the ship and make sure that you're headed in the right direction. I think it can be quite challenging. Fortunately, because of the internet and stuff, there's a lot of people that do coaching online, and all, obviously there's some coaches that are better than others. I've been lucky and I've worked with some good coaches in the past, actually some of the best around. So yeah,
Yeah.
for those that are looking for it or interested, I do coach people.
Yeah. Well, that's, I mean, a good segue to maybe how to start to wrap things up. If people are interested in, yeah, yeah, maybe they're local in Tokyo and they want to connect and maybe get you on to do some coaching, or they just want to maybe see you with your shirt off and see some pictures. Where's do you sort of post much bodybuilding content of your own through social media or anything like that? Or
Yeah, so I've got an Instagram account,
yep,
which is just at Craig Humble.
yep,
Easy enough to find. I actually just made a post the other day saying, make sure that you take a lot of pictures when you're prepping or dieting for the show, because when you're in the off season, sometimes you struggle for things to post because you don't look as good, obviously. That's kind of where I'm at now. So obviously the posting frequency is a little bit less than what I would like it to be.
yeah,
But when it comes around to competition season, I think that this is probably the case for every bodybuilder that's on Instagram.
yeah,
Is when it comes closer to shows and stuff, the post frequency gets a lot more. I do have some stuff that's kind of interesting that I think people might look. If you scroll through my page, I've got, for example, in the last prep that I did, I've got all of the changes that were made to my nutrition, as well as what sort of training I was doing, et cetera, et cetera. That's all listed out. I did sort of like weekly updates during the course of my last prep last time. So if you want to get an idea of what the process looks like, that's one place that you can start.
yeah, yeah. Terrific. Well, we're actually going to sort of pause the mic, and we're going to Craig and I will just talk a little bit more in terms of training for anyone who's still listening and would like to hear a little bit more about Craig's training and hear a bit more of the sort of nerd side of the bodybuilding. But for everyone else, thank you for listening, and Craig, thank you very much for coming on and sharing your journey. It's amazing what you've done, and yeah, we wish you all the very best with your next competition and yeah, with your career going forward.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. It's been a blast.
Cheers. Thanks, Craig.